Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Strand. My name is Peter, and I help to write the events here. For a little bit of history, the Strand was founded in 1927 over on what was then 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until after over 92 years, Strand is the sole survivor, still run by the Bass family, and still housing new and used books. Tonight, I am very excited to welcome Melanie Falick to the Rare Book Room to celebrate the release of Making a Life, Working by Hand and Discovering the Life You Are Meant to Live. It's the result of her multi-continental exploration of the making life, diving into the traditions and practices of a proliferation of crafting disciplines. Melanie is a lifelong maker, a writer, editor, and creative consultant, formerly the publishing director of STC Craft Melanie Falick Books at Abrams, and the editor-in-chief of Interweave Knits magazine. Previous books include Knitting in America, Kids Knitting, and Weekend Knitting, among others. And joining her are several of the makers profiled in the book. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming them and Making a Life to the Strand.
Well, before we start, you all got cotton jersey ties, and you probably don't know what you're supposed to do with them. It's basically, I think most of us are probably makers. It's just so that you can keep your hands busy, and the project is you just make knots in your cotton jersey ties. And, the woman back there, who happens to be my mother, has one that I made for her.
Oh, that's a nice one. I like the red one. That's beautiful.
So this is one that I made last December, basically out of old white T-shirts that I did with friends, and we knotted them all up, and then we dyed them in madder, which is a natural dye. So if you have old white T-shirts and you want to make use of them, and this is one of my friend Kay's, which is quite elaborate. And the cotton jersey ties come from Alabama Channon, and Natalie Channon is one of the people profiled in the book. And I believe that Kay bought this from the company. So this is like the real professional version. And this is my version. and this is the one I just started back
in the green room.
In the green room.
Yes.
Which helped me to calm down and keep my hands busy. And there's no wrong way to do it. You can connect ties, in the middle of everything. If it doesn't seem right, just make more knots and keep going.
We're all good at making knots, aren't we? I mean, I usually make them in my shoulders, but we all know how to make knots.
Okay. So I'm just going to start out by telling you a little bit about myself and how I came to write this book. I grew up in a home where making by hand was kind of ordinary. I felt like my parents both made things sometimes because, we needed something and there was an economic reason to do it. And sometimes just because they wanted to do it. So I remember my mother sewing clothes for me when I was really little, and I think probably at that time that was less expensive than buying clothes, and that was a good thing at that point in our lives. But when we got to a different point where maybe we could have bought clothes more easily outside of our house, or shopping, she continued to make things just because she really liked it. My father did landscaping, he did sculpting, he did ceramics, and really asked me and my brother to really pay attention to what people did by hand and to really appreciate that and honor that. So that was just a normal part of life, and it was kind of a surprise to me when I got older and had a career in publishing and I started to knit, and I realized that that was considered really unusual and odd, and not everybody could do that, or not everybody thought that would be a great thing to do. And gradually, as my career evolved, I combined my passion for knitting at first and my passion for writing and editing and making magazines and books, and I combined them together and worked for many years doing that. And that was wonderful, but I got to the point in my last job, which was with Abrams, where I felt like I was so busy making a living, and I was so busy creating a consumer product, and what was being asked for was books with projects in them. So it was all about giving people stuff to make. And what I was always much more interested in was why we make, the impulse to make. And so I decided ultimately that it was time for me to leave, that I needed I needed to kind of recalibrate, and I didn't know what I was going to do. So I took some time off, and I had freelance work so that I could pay the bills, and then I started making stuff, not knowing what would be next, but that just seemed really normal to me. And one day I took a square of paper and I made a box out of it, following some directions from a video. And I was just kind of amazed, and I thought, that's such a simple skill that most of us don't have, and it could be really useful if I had lived a long time ago. And I realized what I really wanted was to be connected to my survival. When I was working in publishing in the corporate world, I didn't have time to mow my own lawn. I barely had time to to pull the weeds in my garden. I hired somebody to build a screened-in porch. I wanted to be knitting. I wanted to be sewing. I was publishing books about all these topics, but I actually wasn't doing it that much. I was making a good living, but I wasn't making a good life. At the same time, this DIY renaissance was brewing, and I found that more and more people were interested in this subject or these skills. And people, not only were they knitting and sewing and quilting, but they were starting to raise chickens in their backyards and preserve fruits and vegetables, and that there really was this urge to do this, and that I wanted to really write about what that was, and I wanted to stop feeling like I had to defend what I did as sort of, I think the idea of like the books I worked on were always categorized as craft and hobby, which to me made it seem like they weren't that important. You know, they were what you did when the important things were finished. And I thought, no, this is a lifeline. This is what makes me feel like me. And why is it that has always felt like other? So I wrote the book that we're here to talk about or celebrate today. And I wrote it, someone asked me recently, well, why did you write it? And I was like, I want to change the world. And one of the people that I wrote about, Jessica Green, who's a weaver, she said that she inherited from her grandmother the believing in the impossible, and the idea that it may seem impossible to change the world, but there's no reason not to try. Mm-hmm. And I really feel like if we can reconnect with our hands, we can reconnect with our own capabilities, our own mastery, our own connection to the earth and to all of the resources that the earth provides for us, then we're going to care about ourselves, one another, and our planet a lot more. You know, we really come to this naturally. We've been makers for hundreds of thousands of years. It's only really recently, since the Industrial Revolution, that we stopped being makers. And then the digital revolution only kind of made that go even faster. So I think that the urge to make things and the interest in it is really something that we all feel, and it's a way of kind of saying like speed and infinite economic growth and consumption is not working. It's not working for us. I don't see it making people very happy. I feel like we have these tools, these machines and these computers, and as like human beings create tools, and then the tools change us. And I feel like the tools that we have right now that everybody is saying are so important, they're never going to go away. And I'm not saying that they're bad, but I'm saying we need to be really conscious of what those tools are doing, and then we need to be really conscious about what these tools are doing, so that we can prioritize making a living and making a good life at the same time. So that's what I did and why I did it. And I want to introduce you to these wonderful women here, which I realize they're from all different parts of the world. And I'm just going to ask them to tell you a little bit about who they are and how the role of making by hand has played out in their lives. So I'm going to start with Keiko.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Keiko just had a baby, so she did literally make a life.
Literally make a life.
Yes.
And the pace of life has slowed down.
Yeah. So
quite
Keiko
significantly.
Yeah,
And
Keiko's from, let me just,
sure.
sorry. Keiko's from Japan, and when I interviewed her, it was really interesting to me to find out that when she grew up, making by hand, I think was somewhat like what it was when I grew up here, where it was just a normal part of everyday life. Yet, even with that, and even with the fact that she said there were loads of even TV shows about making by hand, and within the culture they really honored it, she came here to become a lawyer.
I want to try to become a lawyer.
And now she is the founder of the Brooklyn Shoe Space, where you can go to learn how to make your own shoes. And she's also the founder of the Brooklyn Shoe Factory, where if you want to design shoes, she and her partners can make them for you.
Yes. Oh, thank you for the intro.
Okay.
A little bit about myself. I grew up in rural Tokyo. I always had family members who had a hobby of something. So it was photo, retouching to developing, actually. It wasn't retouching, no, not back then. Developing, knife sharpening, just making clothes, making knitting clothes for us, making kimonos or yukatas for the grandchildren that my grandma would do. And I was also a part of Girl Scouts. We also had home ec where we made shirts, we made bags, we had woodworking, we had electronic stuff. Like we made all the time. But then, of course, once you go into college and the route that you want, a typical Asian family, coming from a typical Asian family, we had 3 siblings, all girls. Parents wanted a lawyer in the family, a doctor in the family, and a businesswoman in the family. So I think they were trying to instill in me that, you know, you can do the lawyer, you can be a lawyer, and always gave me books about becoming a lawyer from when I was younger. And I really bought it for a little while, but at the same time, I was always interested in the arts and the fashion. And if I were to become a lawyer, I wanted to do practice art law, which is speaking with all the lawyers in town. They say, never do that, and it's impossible to pay your, you know, bills with it and all this. Anyway, I thought that would be in my career, and I can do a hobby of making shoes or tears in my afterlife, or my as a hobby. And my then boyfriend actually encouraged me to, you know, you don't have to wait that long, and you can just try to take a class. So I looked it up, and there was a shoemaking class, and so I took that class, and I got really hooked, and I kept on making since, and followed different teachers, went to learn from master shoemaker in Savannah, and did pattern making with another maker. Just kept on learning from different people, because there wasn't really a school here that kind of gave the overview as well as the resources and everything. And FIT had some classes, yes, Pratt had some classes, Parsons as well, but they made half pairs. You know, I'm like, who wants a half a pair of shoes? You know, I mean, I have 2 feet, so I wanted a pair. So the same teacher back then taught at community center, so I started following her. And I realized there's no resource for any makers, and there's so many people making, a lot of industry here in New York. A lot of people go abroad to learn how to make shoes and come back and have no place to really nurture their making and go into corporate. And so I thought that since I started making and loving the process, and once I actually had my own line and sent it off to China to have them produced, and realizing, oh, I really miss the making part. I don't care if they make it better than me, and they can make more quantity for less money for me. I really miss the making, so I brought it back. And to make things a little faster, I relied on and got more tools, and some handmade, like master shoemakers. Some people don't like using tools, like heavy duty power tools. Yes, they use hand tools, but I rely on it. Like, yeah, there's no tomorrow. Like, you know, sander. I'm gonna use a sander. I'm not going to hand sand something forever, because I want to do it faster, and so forth. And I started acquiring a lot of equipment, and then realized that I don't use it enough myself alone. And so I started sharing my space with other shoemakers, and that's how I started creating a community. And now I think we are really like a stable resource for the shoemakers, leather makers, leather workers, bag makers, and people come and use machinery, equipment, tools. They come and ask for, recommendation, and so forth. So I'm trying to build a community so that we're not alone doing some craft that nobody really knows about or how to teach or what, there's not really like a resource for people to learn in a constructive way, and constructive yet something that's manageable and accessible to beginners. So,
I think what's really interesting about Brooklyn Shoe Space is that it is a combination of people like me, going and learning how to make a slide or an espadrille, and then it's people that are really pursuing this on a very high level and everything in between, and it does really feel like a supportive community.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like where you,
Yep.
like Art Yard. So this is Elsa Mora. Elsa is originally from Cuba.
Yes.
And she is a multimedia artist and also creative director. I can't remember.
Artistic director.
Artistic director of the Art Yard, which is an art center in Frenchtown, New Jersey. And Elsa's story is really fascinating for a lot of different reasons, but two things that happened that I think really we can affected it that are interesting are that she was in Cuba during the fall of the Soviet Union, and her hands and making by hand became something very, very important to her at that time. And then again, after she was here, her second child was born and was diagnosed with autism, and once again she turned to making by hand as a way to process and live. So Elsa, you want to tell us more?
Yes. So I was born and raised in Cuba, and I came here in 2001. I met my husband in Havana, and he's also a creative person. So yes, my childhood was very challenging. I come from a really large family with 8 kids and a single mother who raised all of us with really nothing. She had the worst jobs. She didn't get paid well. But she was extremely creative and smart, like street smart. So she brought that awareness that you have the tools within you already from birth to do a lot of things. So you just have to use them. And that's how I grew up. It wasn't a luxury to do things by hand. It was actually a necessity and a survival activity. So you had to make your own shoes and your own clothes, and anything that you had was mostly made by yourself. So I came here and I immediately noticed something that made me a little bit sad, which was the huge lack of a sense of community as a culture compared to the type of community I was coming from, where everybody support each other, we help each other, we make things together. There is a tradition once a year where someone brings a gigantic pot in the middle of the street, and everybody throws whatever they have, a potato, whatever you have. You bring it, you put it there, and then you make a big soup, and everybody comes and eat. And it's amazing, and the kids are running all over the place and screaming, and people are laughing, and I was waiting, okay, when is the annual soup here? What are you talking about? There is no annual soup. So that was like, oh, really? And so what is it that you guys do once a year? Well, there is Christmas where you buy a lot of presents, like 3 months before, and then you... So anyway, that was a big cultural shock to me. And then the process of understanding this culture was extremely interesting because I learned a lot. To make the story short, because I could go on forever, but I'm an artist, and I was already an artist in Cuba. I had a career, I was traveling, I was doing well, working with galleries, mostly because we were very lucky, a tiny island. People were curious, what are these artists doing there? So a lot of people from here, especially from this city, came there from different museums, and they brought artists here. And we were very lucky to have a platform in America. So I was one of those people. I was very lucky. But the thing is that I became an artist, and in a way, and this is the funny contradiction, I felt isolated. Yeah, I had, and I still have a career. in that area, but I was lacking still that sense of community. And to make the story short, I ended up doing what I'm doing right now. I still have my career. I'm a mother. I'm very involved with my children, especially with my son Diego. He's 14, and he's autistic, as Melanie said. But then I found this amazing thing that is happening that everybody should know about. And actually, we have two people here that come from there, and that's Candy and Eric. Raise your hand. They are part of Art Yard. So Art Yard is an art center. It's a contemporary art center that has a very nice mission, which is to build and develop and make very strong communities around creativity. And creativity expresses itself through a lot of ways. And one of them is by making things with your hands. So we have one event. Think about the soup I was talking about. This one is called the Hatch. So every year we have this beautiful communal event where everybody comes to celebrate the hatch of something new in your life. So basically we build a gigantic egg with the community, and then the egg cracks, and a lot of people dressing like birds come out. So people make their own bird costumes, children, adults, everybody together. So we have workshops, and so this is the highlight of this communal experience.
There's a parade with
There is a
music.
parade, and everybody comes to the parade, and people show up with their own bird costumes. So there is this idea about bird and freedom and expression and the beginning of something new. And I'm starting to feel that something magical is happening right there. So we have our next hatch. Candy, is that in July? In June. In June, so stay tuned because you're invited. You can go there and dress like a bird. And it's really fun. It's a lot of fun. And the actual things that people create are amazing. Are really elaborate and beautiful and creative and surprising. So that's a big part of what I'm doing right now because I just feel that we need to preserve that idea of community and belonging to something, because it's really sad when you find yourself feeling lonely. It's just not good for you. I was actually reading a book about the effects of isolation and the lack of creativity. It makes people sick, younger. So we all want to live a long life. Raise your hand if you want to live a long life and a healthy life. So anyway, that's what I'm doing basically now. And I feel extremely lucky to be part of that community. And what I do there is whatever needs to be done. My title is Artistic Director and Curator. I curate exhibitions for artists. We do film, we have music, theater, so many things, workshops.
Since I brought up the fall of the Soviet Union, and you didn't answer that part, can you just tell the story of what happened and how, you sort of realized that just using your hands, you could sort of find a way to survive?
Yeah, well, everybody knows what happened with the Soviet Union and Cuba. A lot of the supplies that we had came from there. So imagine one day, out of the blue, like you're not getting all the things that you got before. So we found ourselves literally starving. Like I was almost 75 pounds. Just picture myself, I'm 150 something now. So imagine, I was very, very unhealthy and very starving. I passed out on the street, and I was just one of many people. So we had to learn to survive by using our hands. And I remember that a lot of the people that graduated from art school like me, we had to come up with ideas in order to create things that we could sell. So through that action of all of us getting together and bringing something that we could sell and make as a group, we started finally making a little money and then buying things from some people that were coming from Canada and here. So that was a very traumatic experience, but one that brought a lot of, how do you say, it made us feel very empowered. Like you have more potential than you imagine. and you don't have to depend on anybody else. You actually already have nature is around you. You can grow your own food. You can do all the things that will make you survive. So it was a huge lesson for the whole country because we were very dependent of the Soviet Union, and then suddenly we had to raise from that challenge. And there is a lot of poverty yet still today, but people are extremely resilient. When you have to take your life in your own hands and survive, there is something in the middle of all the sadness is really beautiful. When you make something happen, you feel powerful. And then as a group, you feel even more powerful. And that's that's basically what society is. It's a collection of humans. Society is not an abstract thing. It's just people, right? And when every person does the best that they can do to create, to make things, is good for everyone. So my philosophy is that the way you change society is by changing yourself one by one, like by getting in touch with your full potential, and doing things that you never thought you could do. So that's the way you change things around, one person at a time.
Yeah, and I think that, my idea is that what we do with our hands, it's not necessarily, when we make things with our hands, like we're not all going to have a career as hand makers, but if we do that with our hands and we develop mastery and we feel like I would say I felt when I was working so hard and I wasn't using my hands, I felt like my hands were literally tied behind my back. Not because I couldn't, my lifestyle made it impossible, or even the way things are designed now so that you're not meant to fix them, you're meant to throw away and replace them, or it's really hard to open the toaster now if it was broken to figure out how to fix it. They make it so it has a special screw that you don't have the screwdriver for because they want you to buy a new one. And this idea that all this stuff that made by machines is, I think we were sold this idea that it's somehow better, and then we think if I make a loaf of bread, people think I'm a wizard, and it's flour, water, and time, and people used to do that every day, and I feel like there's this big disconnect between our own potential and with how our culture is evolving, and I think that is so important. And so I'll move on to Renata now, because Renata, who comes to us from Germany, was a maker way back from being a very small child, but she found her way first in Germany and then here through Waldorf education, and then has been very involved for many years on educating teachers who are educating children, and within the Waldorf system, making by hand plays a pretty prominent role. So, Renata.
Thank you. Yes, I grew up in Germany, and it was after the war. I was born in 1941. So I was surrounded by makers. My mother and also my grandmother were very amazing. They were spinning and they were knitting and they were gardening. And what I remember mostly is the mood around the activity. There was a kind of warm feeling about it. It was not, let's quickly get something done, although of course there was a lot of pressure to get things done because you couldn't buy anything. But as a child somehow, or at least as an adult, I remember that as a child I was really moved by their gestures, by their warmth that went, the joy also that they had about making. And I think it really formed me very much. And I also had a handwork teacher at school that I loved, and I loved every class, and it was always magic what we could do. And so, and my children, I have 2 children, my daughter is right there. When they began going to Waldorf kindergarten in Heidelberg, Germany, I was so overjoyed because now I could make toys. I don't know whether any of you know the beauty of Waldorf toys. Simplicity, beauty, natural materials. When I made my first pair of lambs, sheep, and gave them to my children, it was a highlight of my life, more or less. So then we came to America, and in America I was involved in the school that the children went to, again, a Waldorf school, and became a volunteer assistant and handwork teacher there. And then I was actually asked to teach Waldorf teachers to make things, future class teachers, future handwork teachers. And one lady, that elderly lady that played, again, a really big role in my life was Grete Fröhlich, who at the age of 85 saw me making things, and she said to me, I can see that you've used your hands, you need to work with me. So I felt that destiny had spoken. I needed to work with Grete till the rest of her life or the rest of my life. And so we did. So when she died at 100,
Wow.
and we worked through the Waldorf handwork curriculum. We made many things. We took walks in nature, and she could hardly walk and had a walking stick. She would bend down and pick up a little acorn and say to me, look at this shape here, and look what, and so on. So we also looked at art books and studied art and so on. Very often she spoke about gesture. Look at this sculpture. What kind of gesture does the mother have towards the child? And at first I said, what does she mean by gesture? This kind of gesture? But she was actually speaking of an inner quality, of a quality of, spiritual quality, I would say. And so she was training me mostly, I would say, in keen observation, really looking, working with focus, doing one thing, and appreciating the materials. You know, we are working with nature, right, with natural materials. And we are so, nowadays we've become onlookers. You know, we exploit, and so forth. And I think by really observing the gifts from nature, we learn to appreciate, we learn to actually see the wisdom in nature. You know, if I would have a lock of wool here for everybody, I could take you to an experience of what I'm talking about. So anyway, so Grete became an important teacher for me, and I tried to pass on to the students, the adult students I had, some of what she taught me, and hopefully I learned more myself as well, to first of all, be engaged with your whole being, to focus, to be grateful for what you received, to take on the responsibility for what you have. If you take wool from a sheep, you are in a way responsible for that. And then to use your whole being to make something really beautiful. Now, why are we trying to make something beautiful? It's such a question. I know you have that question. And that's not easy to answer. And what is beauty and so forth? It's an innate urge that we all have, right? We are, in a way, when we see something beautiful, we are kind of lifted out of our everyday. We go, this is beautiful. You know, it's lifting us to another realm. I think that, I would say that it's really has to do, I think, with a divine reality that we are lifted into. I'm quite convinced of that. So I have directed the Fibercraft Studio, which is devoted, and it still exists today, is devoted to the teaching of handwork to Waldorf teachers, but as also to anyone interested in coming. The studio is in Chestnut Ridge in New York, and fibercraftstudio.org. You can find workshops and so forth. And I've retired a few years ago, but I feel very connected to it. And I have some of my friends here who are Janet, and Sono, Laura, Jaime. See the hat, the beautiful hat. And I mentioned my daughter, she's a Waldorf graduate. I'm retired from the studio, but I'm not inwardly separated. I'm very much connected with it. And I'm living now in a community for the elderly. My husband is in need of full-time care, so he's receiving that. I live in an apartment, and this community, again, emphasizes the work with our hands. There's a wood shop, there's a pottery, there's a knitting group that I belong to. There is, what else is there? Candle making shop, and so forth. So the crafts are playing a very, very important role in making life for the people who are there and who can still work with their hands more fulfilled.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. If you look at children, just observe children, like I think Liz Gilbert wrote in her book, Big Magic, like you've never had to teach a little kid what to do with a Lego, or, if we gave a child, this rope, they would do something with it. And when kids finger paint or draw or dance or sing, we all celebrate that, and we think it's really beautiful. But then through our culture and our educational system, there's this idea that you should become serious and do something else, and maybe you're not the best at painting, so maybe you should not do that because you're not the best. And one thing that I've realized in spending all this time working on the book is that creative expression is just so important, I think, for every human being. And it's a continuum. And, it's not a continuum like this is the bottom and this is the top. It's just a continuum that goes this way. And I don't think anything's better than anything else. I think that we all need to express ourselves creatively, and we might do that through making by hand the way all of us do it. But if we don't find that somehow, it's like a pipe is clogged. There's a feeling of unwellness. And I think that it's strange to me that, we celebrate that in children, and then we have this long period of thinking like, oh, well, again, if you should do what's important, and then if you have leftover time, you can have a hobby. But then when people get older and they have more time, they pick these things up again and really enjoy them. And I don't think it's that we don't enjoy them in the middle. I think that a whole life of creative expression is a happier life than a life of just speed and infinite economic gain and consumption. That doesn't seem to be working. But I think we're using up all our time quickly, and we haven't heard from Lata yet. And it's funny that you grew up in a place where you did a lot of making by hand, and a lot of the people around you were doing things like building houses and gardening and all of that. And I keep on thinking, we're not so old. Like, it feels like, that like kids growing up today, I guess it's just in the suburbs or whatever. I think that we're all saying that this formed us, and that we think that we want that to continue, that we shouldn't be exceptional in this way, right?
Exceptional. It's hard to comment on all of this because I guess I will just say I share a lot of what you're saying. Growing up in Scandinavia on an island in the middle of the Baltic Sea, and as an islander, you had to figure things out and how to do things with your hands for survival. Now, I didn't grow up that way and directly because of when I was born, but and neither did my mom. My mom was she was going to make a career and wasn't really a maker, but her mother was. So my grandmother and that generation is my grandmother's generation is who I grew up with and got this hand-making exposure by baking cinnamon rolls and knitting and all of these things that you've been saying too. So I grew up in Stockholm, and I come from a little bit of a different, trying to make it short and help me edit, because I started my company in 1996, and I have now 23 or 24 years of running a company, being a creative person. I'm a textile designer, and I create patterns and motifs that gets printed on things. And I came to America when I was 19, and I moved to California. And I always been a very creative person. I just had no idea how to channel it. And I had no idea how to make a living doing it. And I think that was the biggest thing. So I was searching to do, how do I make money? I need to make a living. Of course, we all need to make a living. How do we make a living? And I knew that obviously I'm not going to be a fine artist. I'm not going to make any money doing that. So I started looking into interior design, and went to different schools and went to different events. And I was like, no, this is not my jam. This is not what I want to do. I enrolled in a community college, and just to take all kinds of classes to see what I wanted to do. And jewelry, ceramics, jazz appreciation. And I took screen printing, and that's where my cultural heritage of growing up with a lot of handmade textiles and having textiles in our home and everyday life, table runners, pillows, napkins, towels, and I come from Scandinavia. I'm like inundated with patterns my whole childhood, and with makers through my family and my upbringing on this island. So after the screen printing class, I decided I'm just going to start my own company. And for me, I came from a business point of view. I didn't feel this strong urge to do this because I'm a maker. I came from, this is how I'm going to make my money, but I'm going to be able to do it using my hands. So I was like, I'm going to screen print, I'm going to make cushions, I'm going to make products that I can sell. Like, I have actually things to sell, and this is practical, and you can use it in your everyday life. That's where I started 23 years ago. Now, fast forward, I've done a lot of different things. I've licensed, I've had brick and mortar shops, I had online shops, I had websites, I've written 12 books, and this is how I met you. We've made 2 books together. I run workshops, and I would say through all this, 23 years later, and it's impossible for me to make this short because I saw 3 minutes. Like, I feel like the Oscar special. For me, the 23 years has always been, I'm a maker, unavoidably, but it took me a really long time to figure that out. I kind of resisted it because I'm making business, I'm gonna make money. I love making them, but what I always was really pig-headed about making all my patterns with my hands. I had to draw them with pen and ink. I cut paper. I wanted to hear the crinkles. I wanted to get glue under my fingers, and I refused to learn how to do Photoshop. I mean, I tried. Actually, I felt like I really should learn how to do Photoshop, and I hated it. I was like, no, this is not how I want to create my patterns and my motifs. I love the interaction with the paper, but I'm a designer, not a maker, and I'm making a business. So it took me a long time to sort of realize, and actually, it wasn't quite me who highlighted that. It was another editor who sits in this room, actually, from Japan. And I started working in Japan and selling my designs and licensing my designs, and I had an exhibition there, and we met, and she's an editor for magazines, and she was really interested in my process and in my sketchbooks, and how are you thinking, and where is your inspiration, how do you make things, how do you come up with these things? And we started creating a column together for 4 years where I'm penning this column about how am I thinking as a maker. She saw it, and much earlier than I even knew that that's a very, very important part of me. now, currently, I mean, and I still struggle with this in many ways. I'm licensed, which means that I rent out my designs to other companies and they produce products with my name on it, with my patterns. It's a very removed process. It's not very handmade. It can be incredibly gratifying, and because we make beautiful things, but sometimes not. And sometimes they're quite horrible, actually. And my hand hasn't touched it, but my name is on it. And then I have my artistic integrity tied into that, and it's been really, really challenging. So for me, it's been a struggle to figure out how to be. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I just wish. Like when I first started, I was a waitress during the day, and I used to make things as a hobby. Sometimes I'm like, oh, that was much better. Because I would just make my money and not worry about it and not have all these feelings, and because it's really important. It's really, really a part of me. It is my lifeline. It is my emotion. It's everything. So it's really hard to separate those things. Making a living, a business, being a very, very creative person and caring too much. So it's interesting conversation that I still have today, 23 years. I still haven't figured it out. Some days I'm leaning that way, and some days I'm like, no, I should do it this way. But it's a constant conversation.
So I know question one, it's taken the whole time, but I'll just say, you know, the book is divided up into 5 chapters, and there's remembering, which is sort of remembering where we come from, remembering all the skills that we want to not let be forgotten, and the lineage of making that we come from. And then we have slowing down, which is something that making by hand allows us to do naturally in most cases. I mean, most forms of making allow us to slow down. And I think that is sort of a counterpoint to so much of what happens in our world. And then there's joining hands, which is about community. And we don't come together. I mean, I love the idea of coming together to make a soup where we all bring an ingredient, but you know, that's not happening a lot. But I think that whether, you know, it's a knitting guild or a sewing group or a book event like this, when we come together and we talk about what we love to do with our hands, we actually create a community. So I think that's really beautiful. And then it's also, when we make by hand, you know, we can make a home feel like our own, as opposed to something that we've sort of just purchased things for. And we can also feel at home in our own skin. And you know, I was running around today and yesterday and this week, and I just felt like what I really need is just to sit down and knit. And that would make me feel like me rather than a chicken with her head cut off. And then finally, it's a way to find a voice. And this gets back to this whole idea of creative expression. I don't think people can be happy if they can't find a way to express themselves. And for us, it's with our hands, and probably we all do other things as well. But my hope is, I said I want to change the world, is what we're talking about here, that will reverberate out, and that you'll talk to somebody else about it, and that it will stop feeling, you know, maybe we can get the arts in schools refunded. We can have them funded again. I mean, imagine another world where all the things that we got out of that growing up and through our adult lives, and I imagine a lot of you, where it doesn't feel like that is endangered, where it feels like it's honored and celebrated. So, we're done. So, who's going to ask the first question of any of us?
And we love questions.
So if you have a question, just raise your hand and I will bring you the mic. Bonus points for going first.
How did you find everyone?
So it's a tricky question to answer because it wasn't a scientific process. What I realized in the beginning, taking on the subject of why we make things and why it matters, was that it was a subject that was infinite. People have been making things in every corner of the earth since the beginning of humanity.
and every culture has its own making by hand tradition. So I realized that I could just take my journey and I could just follow one thing to another. Some of the people that I asked to be in the book are people that I knew, like Lata. Elsa I met because I went to an event called Makery, and she was one of the teachers there, and I was immediately attracted to what she was saying. And really with each person, it just felt like there was something about their story that resonated with me. I also met Kiko at the Makery, at a different Makery event, and I was taken with that. And Renata, I actually had been watching, there's a YouTube video of Renata that has, as you know, but not everyone knows, like over 100,000 views. And it's Renata talking about why making by hand matters. And she was just like this mythic figure. And then I forget how it happened. Somebody invited me to an event, and then I looked online, and I was like, oh, that's the Fibercraft studio. Maybe Renata would be there. And then I approached Renata, and she was a little suspicious. and then she said, wait a minute, you're Melanie? And I said, yes, and apparently she had been told to talk to me about a book that she wanted to write. So then she opened up and started to trust me a little bit. And, so it was all different ways. There were some people who I found on Instagram. There were some people where somebody says you should look at this person's work or that person's work. But it wasn't about I need to find the people who make the quote unquote most beautiful work. As much as I admire and love the work of all the people in the book, it wasn't that. It was about their story. It was about how they were taking agency over their lives by way of making by hand. And I just needed, to tell the story of my journey in a way that felt well-rounded. And so it was just kind of in the dark, just trying to do that. And, there were some things that were like, oh, I'm going to go to England, so because I've decided I'm going to see this person, so who else is in England near where that person is? I could write this book for the rest of my life. There's not a shortage of makers whose stories I would want to tell. Everybody has a story, and my point is, what I want people to do when they read the book is to feel like they are part of the community of the book, not that somehow the people in the book are other or better, or somehow they made it work and I can't. So.
Any other questions?
What do you think you're going to do next, or do you know what you're going to do next?
Well, I'm staying in a hotel at JFK.
Having dinner.
Yeah, no. It's a really hard question to answer. When I left my job at Abrams, I really didn't know what I was going to do. I really felt like I just needed to slow down. I just needed to be quiet, and I just needed to listen to the voices in my head, not the crazy voices, but not the one that tells you you're not good enough, but the one that kind of whispers to you about what you ought to be doing, or the things that you really want. And that's what doing that and writing down those whispers is what, and I realized everything on my whisper list was either traveling or learning how to do something. And so I was like, oh, I could travel and learn how to do things. And that kind of tied into my whole feeling about what was happening in this world, in our culture with DIY and the Renaissance it was experiencing. So I feel like I am on this whirlwind of a book tour, and once again, I feel like I just need to be quiet. I know that I never want to stop making things. I never want to stop learning. One thing that has come up for me is, aside from creating, knitting a sweater or sewing a dress, or I just took a pottery class, which I really loved and want to do more of, I want to know how things work. I rewired a lamp with a lot of help from a friend. It's not that hard, well, especially when you have someone sitting next to you telling you how to do it, but yeah. But the more I learn about how things work and how to make things, the better and happier, I feel. So I want to keep pursuing that. And I hope that I will be able, as I figure out how to make a living as I move forward, that I'll be able to really balance like the priorities and not get crazy and not get so wrapped up in the work and so wrapped up in like what's happening on my computer or, you know, meeting deadlines that I lose sight of the whispers.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Is writing making for you?
Is writing making?
Or does it have to be with your, I mean, you are typing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you creating at that point? Are you making, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a form of creative expression. And I don't know, it's a hard question for me to answer right now because my editor is here. No, just because writing this book was really, really hard. And I feel like, I feel really proud of it. It was harder for me than I remember writing other books was. Someone said to me recently, and I thought it was the nicest compliment, and he said, I can tell that you put all of yourself in this. And I did. So I feel like, yeah, writing is creative expression. It is using my hands. But I need a little, I've been a writer my whole life.
You need a little clay in there.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, it's the words. I feel like there's a traffic jam of words in my head a lot of the time. Like whether it's the words from the TV or it's my thoughts or it's something I'm reading. And like it really hurts. And I found that one thing that happened when I was writing, I was at the Penland School of Craft doing a writing residency, and a paper cutter, you taught me paper cutting too, and then another paper cutter helped me, and she just gave me paper and a blade and taught me a few things. And I found that turning off the words, and I did it with that blade of the paper cutting, and then I actually borrowed someone's paintbrush, and just thinking without words, just like letting my hand and the flow of my hand, whether it was with a paintbrush or with a blade for paper cutting, that was so restful, and it allowed me to then go back to the writing. It gave me like a pause, and you know, I think that's probably why people doodle and everything, but I try to do that as much as I can, of just like turning off all the words and thinking without words and expressing without words. And I think that, you know, that's what, you know, when we look at art, a lot of it doesn't have words, some does, but I think that it is communication. It's just a different form of communication, and it does reflect like the artist and our culture. And I don't think I understood that before I spent these years working on this book. That why art, like I believed art was important, I believed art should be taught in the schools, but I didn't exactly 100% get it, why. But it goes back to this idea that we all are creative and we all need to express ourselves some way, and sort of tangential to what you asked me, but it's sort of related in my own mind, because writing is making, I just feel like I'm appreciating the fact that you can express without words.
Well, that's all about all the time we have for tonight, but please, a round of applause for Melanie and our